Friends, on November 15th, the armed forces of Ukraine used Neptune long-range missiles to blow up the port of Novorossiysk, Russia's second-largest oil export hub. There were powerful strikes on the port, on the oil terminals, and on the 6th Harris missile unit. This key Russian export node was hit, halting oil exports. Storage facilities for Kalibr missiles, coastal infrastructure, and a ship in the port were all struck. The detonations continued throughout the night while Russia is still trying to extinguish the fires in Novorossiysk. On the front lines, Russia continues to dispose of its own mobilized soldiers. A Russian blogger admits that just near Pokrovsk and Bakhmut, Russia has lost up to 100,000 people. And
so for just these two small towns, Russia has already killed 80 to 100,000 of its own soldiers.
An oil refinery in Saratov has been attacked, and in Crimea there are powerful explosions. Airfields, oil depots, and the sea terminals in Feodosia and Sevastopol are burning. Explosions at Belbek, fires at Skadovsk caused by drones. Airports are closed and the occupiers are trembling. The armed forces of Ukraine say that Flamingo, Bars, and Luty are operating simultaneously in several directions. Let's discuss all this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. I wish everyone good health.
Well, Novorossiysk was really burning today. Such explosions, such images, it just makes your heart rejoice.
That's right. Dasha, how many times have we talked about Novorossiysk? I don't know, honestly. Probably a million times. Every other time we said we need to strike Moscow, hit the oil terminals, Crimea, and we mentioned Novorossiysk every now and then. Well, we finally reached it. The security service of Ukraine was the lead, as well as the rest of our intelligence agencies involved in this operation, meaning they were preparing it. And naturally, the Navy was involved since Neptune was used. So these are the naval forces, the coastal missile system Neptune, which also operates in a surface-to-surface mode. And it worked quite well as far as we can tell. Plus, most likely drones were also used, which is why Russian S-300 and S-400 systems were destroyed at that location. So it was a serious aviation preparation. It's as if, for example, pilots were developing strikes of this kind, and that's exactly what happened. There are probably some good professionals there, specifically with an aviation background working at the security service base, who planned a proper, well-executed attack. They neutralized the Russian air defense, which was then unable to intercept the missiles that were already heading directly for their targets. This is called reaching the target at the designated time. In other words, they accomplished the overall combat mission. It's quite a complex operation, but nevertheless, at a distance of probably about 600 to 700 kilometers. In fact, if you measure from Odessa to Novorossiysk in a straight line, it's about 1,000 kilometers. Once again, I'll repeat, they accomplished it perfectly, no question about it. We've been waiting for this for a long time, and there really is such a thing as a celebration. It's just a real celebration, to put it mildly. That's exactly what it is. The main question is scaling up, because Novorossiysk is one of the ports that ships out Russian oil, at least in the European part of the Russian Federation. That is, we shouldn't forget about St. Petersburg or about Ust-Luga and Primorsk either. And also, for example, in the area around Novorossiysk itself. Tuapse is not far from there, and they did a pretty good job on it too. And there's also the so-called Turkish stream running through there. There are two gas pipelines there. The Turkish stream goes underwater, runs along the bottom of the Black Sea, find it and destroy it completely. I mean, Turkey, the Turks, they'll find where to get gas from, especially now that new opportunities are opening up. There's Iraqi and Iranian gas, so they'll pump their own gas into those pipelines, at least from the south and southeast of their country. And as for Russia, they need to forget about it, and the Turks also need to forget about Russia. They're feeding the Russian economy. So this flow of petrodollars going from Turkey to Russia needs to be stopped. So we'll destroy it, just like in Novorossiysk. There are two pipelines running nearby, not far from there. Of course, there's a pumping station there, and it needs to be taken out, just like the Druzhba oil pipeline. That's why we'll have a real celebration when Druzhba is taken out. It's only 50 kilometers from us, and when they get to the Turkish stream.
Roman Lagocha. So just to wrap things up, a strike on the Kalibr missile depots, a strike on the port of Novorossiysk, the Sheskharis oil terminal, a key Russian export hub, and the air defense system. These are the things we've already mentioned and written about. Also, I understand that a civilian vessel was attacked as well, and it was also hit. Roman Lvovich, all these strikes, we recently talked about Tuapse, Novorossiysk, Ust-Luga. How seriously do they impact Russia's military economy? In other words, Russia's ability essentially to continue attacking Ukraine. These are significant and painful blows today.
This is only the beginning of our combat operations as such. if we had pilots at the head of our state and, of course, in the military department as well, that is from the Minister of Defense to the Chief of the General Staff, if the leadership were made up of pilots, just like the Americans do. Who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the US? An F-16 pilot, an F-16 instructor pilot, by the way. And before him, it was the same kind of person, also an F-16 pilot. So these are pilots who, when carrying out and planning combat missions, always start with airstrikes on the enemy's rear positions. That's how any war begins. In other words, until you strike at the enemy's rear, you haven't started the war. You're just getting beaten up like a punching bag. It was the same with Ukraine for the past 11 years. In reality, we only started truly fighting in August 2025 when we got airborne and began striking Russian rear positions and the Russian economy. How long have we been talking about this? We've been discussing this with you for 4 years now. Without air and missile strikes on the enemy's rear, we won't win the war. We'll just keep losing over and over. Because any army, if it has a strong rear, will definitely keep advancing. So you have to start with the rear. And now we can say that for the 4th month, the Ukrainian army's air component has been conducting an offensive operation. The professional Ukrainian army has begun engaging in combat operations. Not yet in full force, they've only just started. Why? Because there are still no ballistic missiles, but they will come eventually. There are no long-range cruise missiles. The air component is not fully operational because aircraft aren't being used until Russian air defenses are taken out, like the S-300 and S-400 systems near Novorossiysk were destroyed. It's a whole process, but it has definitely already begun. Naturally, there are also strikes on the Russian economy, which will lead, first of all, to the collapse of the Russian Empire, because without an economy, without a military in general, empires cannot survive without an economy. They survive only by subsidizing their colonies, extracting certain resources from them, and then returning a portion in the form of petrodollars, thus maintaining the so-called state apparatus. That's how they will start to fall apart, just like the Soviet Union did. What we started doing since August is exactly the beginning of an offensive operation by the professional Ukrainian army against the enemy's rear in general, as an operation itself. We'll sort things out on the ground. Well, as a pilot, I can tell you ground operations can wait, as they say. So right now we need to create a certain kill zone there, not rush anywhere, not advance anywhere. I mean, on the ground, finish off the Russian rear positions. And the opportunity, well, you see, we've only been working for 4 months. It's only the 4th month, and the Russians already have a problem. Maybe it's not a total collapse yet, but Nabulina has already bought Ukrainian lard to grease the ropes, so the process of self-liquidation goes smoothly on some lamppost.
That's what our tandem loves about you, Roman Grigorievich, your sarcasm and sharp wit. Roman Grigorievich, this is a very important topic. It's something my audience constantly writes about in the comments, and they ask us about it under our streams as well. We notice how often the enemy uses ballistic missiles from Bryansk. And the audience asks whether it's possible to destroy the ballistic missile depots in Bryansk. Bryansk is, of course, very close by, practically right next to us. So most likely the capability exists. But why aren't we doing it? Or is it technically very difficult? This is what our Ukrainian audience is interested in.
Well, you need to know exactly where they are located. That's very important here. They still have, let's say, the launchers themselves are mobile, as are the loading vehicles. The transport vehicles as well. So these are mobile systems, and they are constantly on the move. To launch, they move closer to our territory, but their base is much deeper inside. So you still have to locate and find them. And the missiles themselves are produced somewhere. They could even be 500 to 1,000 kilometers away, beyond the Urals for that matter. The missiles themselves can be stored beyond the Urals and then transported by IL-76 or AN-12 aircraft, moving the missiles directly to the launchers. And it's very difficult to track all this traffic. It's possible, yes. At least they managed to locate and destroy a single Iskander transporter loader vehicle, but only one. But there are dozens of them, at least dozens, and there are already hundreds of missiles. That's why it's difficult to do this. Of course, our intelligence is working on it, and eventually we'll get to them. But you can't rely on taking out just a few individual vehicles. The optimal way to defend against ballistic missiles is to have your own ballistic missiles and strike Moscow with them. I'm not saying this for no reason. For several years, we've been talking with you about Novorossiysk. Well, here you go. Good evening. We're from Ukraine. There are some good video clips from there, and you have some too. You'll upload them now. Take a look. So that's the kind of good evening it turns out to be, but it needs to be ballistic, and it should come from Ukraine and head for Moscow. after every strike on Ukraine, on any part of Ukraine, a ballistic missile should go to Moscow, to the Moscow bathhouses, to the Kremlin, to Rubliovka, to the Kremlin, and to military targets in Moscow. That's the Pavlov's dog reflex, a conditioned response. Russians have more of that. They just don't understand any other way. There's a 15-centimeter thick frontal bone, then the back of the head. There's just enough brain for peeing and pooping and only about a centimeter of actual brain. That's the maximum. That's Russians in their purest form, Russian genetics. So it will get through to them like it does to Pavlov's dog. If Kos looks toward Ukraine, 10 thunderbolts strike back on the Kremlin. The second time they just look, another 10 thunderbolts strike. And then when their eyes go cross-eyed, it'll be hard to put them back together. And at that point, they simply won't be able to aim at Ukraine anymore. In other words, there's no other way to cure them. First, it's about treatment, and second, about countering ballistic missiles. Just as the Russians can't counter them, we can't intercept them either. There was an attack on Kyiv with more than a dozen missiles coming in. Yes, we intercepted more than 50% again in the area where the Patriots were stationed. But in places where they weren't, we have 600,000 square kilometers of territory. Even if the Russians have now occupied 100,000 square kilometers, that's still 500,000 square kilometers left for us to cover. Even if we had everything to cover the territory, we would need at least 500 Patriot systems, or for example, several dozen THAADs, or to completely cover it with the Aegis system. In other words, it's practically an impossible task. That's why only mirror strikes on Moscow's bathhouses make sense. Or rather, on Moscow's Rubliovka, and whether it's bathhouses or something else there, that's another matter.
Roman Igorovich, it's being reported that several power units at Russia's Novorossiysk nuclear power plant were disconnected from the grid as a result of a drone attack on the plant the night before last, according to the head of Rosatom. Can you explain what this means for Russia?
Well, first of all, this is the beginning of our already confirmed serious strikes on Russian power generation. This is just the beginning. That is, so far we've been hitting Russian energy infrastructure for about a month now, I think. For several months before that, since August, we were targeting the oil industry, the same air defense systems, mostly in Crimea. But for about a month now, we've started working on Russian energy infrastructure. Just as they started striking our energy sector, we began responding in kind, mirroring their actions. Moreover, we actually have far more opportunities. Russia has 17 million square kilometers. It's simply impossible to cover all of it. I mean, even if the whole world produced air defense systems for Russia, they still wouldn't be able to cover the entire territory. Basically, as they say, nothing has even started there yet. The main thing is to break through the Russian frontline air defense and then move on to military targets. Now, there are already strikes on generation facilities, on major power generation. They are starting to systematically knock out sectors of the Russian power supply system. And what's more, they are achieving what's called a purely synergistic effect here. An accumulation effect, yes. So this synergy should work. You need to keep at it for at least a quarter or two for the Russians to really start feeling, first of all, interruptions in what's called auxiliary generation, which is what allows them to cover peak loads. And then we need to start working on the main generation because they have already struck our nuclear power plants and substations. We need to start hitting all substations in Russia, regardless of what kind of generation is there. In other words, take out the power transmission lines along with the substations that supply them. We already have good specialists. I'm not just saying this for no reason. The Ukrainian professional army has started targeting Russian assets. We have experts, including in the energy sector, Russian energy, the old Soviet system, that old school. And we have specialists who still remember the exact layout of the network, how it was powered back in the day. Why did we have such an energy island in Ukraine? Because we were the first to meet, especially from the southwest. Well, according to the plans, a strike from NATO countries, and our energy system is what you call grid-based, yes, networked. That is, the grid is laid out so that each point can be accessed from different generation sources. The Russians have a linear system, meaning if you cut a line, several cities could go down, or you could even shut off half of Siberia just by hitting a single substation. That possibility exists, especially if you don't forget about dams. The Sayano-Shushenskaya hydroelectric power station has long been asking to be put to bed as well. After the Russian strikes, after the destruction of our Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant and the Kakhovka dam, there should be a mirror strike on the Sayano-Shushenskaya dam. Just look at the area that would be flooded after blowing up that dam. There would be a real sensation in Russia, a major sensation. This is a question, or rather, this is a targeting instruction to the head of the main intelligence directorate and the security services, to Maliuk and Budanov. At the moment, we must not forget about the Foreign Intelligence Service. They have their own confidants there. I think we will soon hear that we have finally seen strikes on Novorossiysk. We will also hear about strikes on this kind of generation system. Because the Sayano-Shushenskaya hydroelectric power station is a hydroelectric plant that provides a significant flow of electricity to central Russia.
Roman Grigorievich, the oil refinery in Saratov has been attacked. I think this isn't the first time. We seem to have a habit of attacking the Saratov oil refinery. The floor is yours.
Well, we've joked about this before, haven't we? The married folks in Saratov can be congratulated. There are so many golden lights on the streets of Saratov, right? So from that song, it seems they're probably increasing the number of those lights. At least someone seems to like it. It's not even certain that this is our doing at all. So the married folks of Saratov, or rather Saratov's married folks, could in principle either be guiding our drones themselves or carrying out these kinds of tasks on their own. The next night, they're already having a sensation over there. But in reality, of course, the Saratov oil refinery, which is currently involved in supplying the main types of fuel for the Russian army, including the Engels airfield, which is located on the left bank of the Volga. Saratov is on the right bank, Engels is on the left bank, and work in this direction is a priority for us. The oil refinery is on the right bank, and on the left bank, there is the fuel and lubricants depot of the Engels airfield itself. We must not forget about the caissons under Engels either. There are hundreds of thousands of tons of aviation kerosene there. We need to reach them and try to figure out some mechanisms. Here, our special services need to figure out how to reach these very caissons, which contain the strategic reserve of Russian aviation kerosene for strategic aviation. First of all, we need to help our Kazakh brothers there. They've been asking for so long to do something so that the Volga would turn and flow not into the Caspian, but into the Aral Sea. The Aral Sea, well, they just sucked it all dry, every last bit of it. So we need to help both the Kazakhs and I think the Uzbeks too. Uzbekistan is also connected to the Aral, but still we need to take a closer look. If you blow up those caissons underground, the ones in the karst caves beneath Engels, then the Volga will change its course and flow into the Aral as well. So, and as for the Caspian, they'll come up with something there. They'll probably have to divert water from the Azov Sea into the Caspian because it's already 30 meters below sea level there, both the Caspian and the area around it. In other words, we need to help our brothers on the other shore, including the Caucasian republics, and then, of course, the Uzbeks and Kazakhs as well. We'll see. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. The stands, yes, no question about it, but these are the stands that are definitely helping us.
Roman Grigorievich, well, undoubtedly one of the most important topics is how the defense forces are attacking Crimea. Today, a major article came out about what we've accomplished over the past few days. So in Crimea, there have been strikes on airfields, oil depots, and sea terminals in Feodosia and Sevastopol, explosions in Belbek, fires at drone warehouses, airports have been closed, and the defense forces have carried out the largest operation in recent months. Strike drones, Flamingo missiles, and Fierce drones were all operating simultaneously in several directions across Crimea. Let's discuss what was attacked, because as I understand it, this was a large-scale operation that included strikes on a number of key targets.
I've already noticed an interesting pattern. As soon as we start cursing out our military and political leadership in the strongest possible terms for not destroying the Druzhba oil pipeline, they immediately turn their backs on it and start working on the opposite side. Well, Crimea is to the south and Druzhba is to the north. They turn around and start pounding in that direction like, we don't understand, we don't see anything, we don't know where this Druzhba is, we're busy with Crimea here. That's pretty much how it goes. That's, well, a friendly caricature of them, so to speak. In reality, of course, they did a poor job with Crimea. It's one of Russia's 3 Achilles heels. We've talked about this before. Moscow, oil, Crimea. These are the 3 Achilles heels. And if you start putting pressure on them, the Russians, if you press on these heels, will eventually give up the ghost, just like Achilles did. Though in the Russians' case, it's not to God, but more likely straight to the devil. So what makes Crimea interesting for us? Well, first of all, it's an operational cauldron. Geographically, it's surrounded by sea on all sides. The entrance and exit are not very wide either, and they can be controlled. Approaching from the sea from any direction on the wing, basically right over the water at extremely low altitudes, is safe. Well, at least with a certain safety margin, you can approach Crimea and take out military targets which are packed in there like sardines in a can. There are 150 stationary sites and another 100 mobile military targets, and we know exactly where each of them is located. Besides the fact that Atesh is operating there are plenty of informants from our intelligence services, and our partners are providing us with intelligence in this direction. Naturally, we know exactly where to strike. The question is, do we have enough means to do it? In addition to the drones that are operating there now, some types of missiles have started to be used as well, including certain types of missiles. Neptune is working quite well. There just aren't many of them. Well, you have to understand, after all, it's a very expensive missile and it's complex to manufacture. In other words, this is truly a world-class missile, and it should be used to hit specific, highly important targets, ones that are worth spending such a missile on. And all the other means of attack, which firstly should be inexpensive, like the Bars or the Flamingo, for example. Well, by the way, the Bars is actually a pretty good missile they've come up with, a missile drone with a range of 500 to 600 kilometers. It's quite capable of reaching Crimea and accomplishing its combat mission. It needs to be put into mass production. It's just that private companies are still, as we can see, struggling with serial production because it requires something specific, like the Neptune, for example. So that's Luch Design Bureau, a state enterprise, the Luch Design Bureau. The same goes for the Lyutia, that's the AN-196, that's Antonov, also a state enterprise. That's why I would say, while the Flamingos are flying down south in Israel, they've flown away. We really need to seize the initiative and launch this missile, for example, start producing the same Flamingo missile at the state, put it into state production. Then it will actually be useful. It's a really good missile. It just needs to be refined, put into mass production, and deployed over Crimea. It will operate from the seaside. That is, it can perform horizontal flight missions, at least approach from the sea at extremely low altitude and hit practically all military targets in Crimea. This is definitely possible, but it needs to be put on a serious track, not on the track of some fly-by-nights who then have to be tracked down somewhere in the south, in Israel, in Bali, or wherever else. It's complicated. So only a state enterprise. Well, we'll see. I think next year, after the change of the executive branch, which definitely needs to happen because this cabinet of ministers has, well, really messed things up. To put it in their own slang, since there's at least a semi-criminal vibe among them, they should be sent to the front. The front is waiting for them. All this riffraff 1, riffraff 2, the front has been waiting. And the cabinet of ministers needs to be filled with a government that has the people's trust. That's very important. And ideally, this government of public trust should be made up of people with basic military education, including technical backgrounds. And on the basis of this government of public trust, we should launch mass production of the missiles we need, especially ballistic ones.
Dear audience, please like this video. Every like and comment you leave while watching this video helps us reach as many people as possible around the world. This is very important because Roman Grigorievich and I are discussing very important topics. Roman Grigorievich, so a Russian blogger spoke about the scale of the disposal of his fellow countrymen. That's a quote. In these two small towns, Pokrovsk and Bakhmut, Russia has already killed 100,000 of its own soldiers. They were not killed by Ukraine, but by Russia itself, he says. The situation will only get worse. They are being sent to die for the sake of little Pokrovsk. End of quote. This was stated by a Russian blogger. And in fact, Russian war correspondents are complaining about exactly this situation. But as I understand it, this doesn't matter to Putin at all. And for Russia, the situation right now is not critical. Roman Grigorievich, what do you think?
Well, public opinion in Russia is already starting to change, but according to the latest data from VT Siom, which is basically a government mouthpiece after all, they just report whatever they're told to, and they can't just blatantly twist the facts anymore. So now, at the very least, they're showing that only 30% still support military actions against Ukraine, a third, whereas it used to be 2/3 or almost everyone. Now only a third remain. And that's according to VTSIM's data, and now more than half, let me repeat, this is a government-affiliated agency, are reporting that more than half of Russians are now clearly against conducting military operations, that is, against the war. And that's even before any forced mobilization has taken place. So what the blogger is lamenting about, he's actually lamenting about mercenaries, essentially, because everyone who dies in Ukraine, all the Russians are mercenaries. That is, they go there for money to kill Ukrainians. So who is really going to mourn them that much? That's why Putin basically, on the one hand, understands that he's simply buying the lives of these Russian idiots. And on the other hand, he probably already has data from closed sources that sense the general mood across Russia in this madhouse of rabid dogs. He senses that the same pressure cooker is heating up there and it could blow its lid soon. That's why I think there are definitely problems there. Maybe I'll repeat myself, they won't really cry much for those who went after big money to kill Ukrainians. But if the situation forces them to start the wheel of forced mobilization, then things will get really tough. Then it really will be outright murder, because forced mobilization for the seizure of foreign territories is, of course, 100% the killing of their own people. Then naturally, even Russian society itself won't just let that pass by unnoticed. In other words, the pressure cooker will explode. But I think by that time, the economy simply won't allow Putin to conduct any military operations at all. If no one stops us, and it's very important that no one stops us so that some bastard doesn't crawl out now and start saying, oh no, oh dear, let's not strike. Let's set some kind of truce for the Russians there, cover up Russian oil refineries and so on with our own bodies, with our own asses. But this already happened in March of this year. We heard this perfectly well from that green government. They were rushing over there, those little green weirdos, and telling us that they had reached some kind of energy truce with the Russians, that they had stopped strikes on Russian oil refineries. Back in March of this year, Palace was practically jumping out of his skin, telling us all this from that office of the great Mongols or Mughals or whatever they call themselves, the Flaminches. So this problem exists. If no one stops us, then the Russians have a bright future ahead of them. If there are Russians listening to us right now, and they are listening to us, Russians, you have a bright future ahead of you. In 3 years, the Russian Federation, the prison of nations, will no longer exist. Get ready to govern your own republics, your own state entities, based on those resistance forces that are currently helping Ukraine to bring about the collapse of the Russian Federation. To everyone out there who cares.
Roman Grigorievich, well, as for the outcome, we've already analyzed the situation in Pokrovsk-Kupiansk, and we've seen that Russia has set certain deadlines. Pokrovsk by mid-December, and then Kupiansk. And we see that the president was at the Pokrovsk front, and Syrskyi was at the Pokrovsk front as well. Zelensky's latest statements are that we will not sacrifice our soldiers, meaning the lives of our soldiers are a priority, so he will listen to this opinion. It is very important to him. Roman Grigorievich, what is the situation now? The floor is yours.
Well, Donbass is being surrendered. What's the situation? They didn't just start talking now about not holding on, about pulling out and letting others take over and so on and the like. Pokrovsk must be held. The Pokrovsk line must be held, not the city itself or Myrnorad. I mean some position there. The line must be held. And when statements are made like, wow, we won't stay here, we're ready to leave, we're ready to pull out from there. That's called surrendering Donbass, which has already started, at least in the Pokrovsk direction, since last year when Zaluzhny was removed. After that, the Russians started pouring into Avdiivka and then to Ocheretine, Socheretine, Selidov, Pokrovsk. That's when the Western Donbass started to be surrendered, meaning the Pokrovsk direction. And in the summer of this year, when everyone rushed to cover Kyiv with their bodies from the Kursk magnetic anomaly, remember that. How many times did we talk about this? Why are you running there? There's no one there to put pressure on Kyiv. What Kyiv are you talking about? When they had already gathered more than 100,000 reserves near Pokrovsk by then. So what Kyiv are you talking about? In other words, they gave up Donbass, they gave up Pokrovsk. So this is the surrender of Pokrovsk and an attempt to cover up the surrender of Donbass by pretending to care about the personnel. Well, to put it mildly, this is, let's say, not a good move because everyone understands perfectly well who led things to this surrender. That is, who brought things to the point where our guys are now dying in certain areas, specifically in Pokrovsk and Myrnorad. And it's only because they allowed the Russians to cross the road to Kostiantynivka this summer, meaning they gave them the opportunity to start encircling Pokrovsk and Myrnorad. Now there are these so-called great saviors, I call them the rescuers, the announcer rescuers. First they announce some nonsense and then we never see it. No ballistics, no flamingos, nothing at all. Only the flamingos are still flying somewhere. And then come the rescuers. So here's a big message for these rescuers. The Pokrovsk line cannot be surrendered. We won't be able to take back Pokrovsk anymore. The Russians have already crawled in there. So the entire line, the whole front must not be given up. I'm talking about the line itself. There are elevations there. The same citadel in Pokrovsk, Krasnoarmeyskaya, Zapadnaya, and the direction toward Dobropolye. If you look at the elevation map, it's what's called a ridge of heights, about 200 meters high. It can't be surrendered. It's the last one. Further west, all the way to the Dnipro, it's just open fields, flat as a table, dropping from 200 to 30 meters. And beyond that, it's what they call no man's land. That's what's called operational space. If the Russians are allowed to reach there, they'll be near the Dnipro, not just the city of Dnipro, but along the Dnipro River from Zaporizhia to Kremenchuk. So here we are acting like we're these great saviors and pretending we have nothing to do with any of this. It's like saying, Lung, it's not me and this isn't my house. Well, that's not a very good approach, especially coming from the top levels of military and political leadership. We need to hold the Pokrovsk line. We have to hold it. Otherwise, we'll end up losing not just Donetsk region, but also Dnipropetrovsk or even Berezhny. And on top of that, we could also lose Zaporizhzhia.
Dear audience, please like this video. Write a few words of support for the armed forces of Ukraine in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from. Roman Svitan and I, a well-known military analyst, discuss the current military and political situation in Ukraine 3 times a week. Roman Hryhorovich, thank you and see you this Monday.
Goodbye.